Hey, I'm Brooke Halliday, licensed professional clinical counselor and your host of Coloring Outside the Lines. I believe that we are the byproducts of our experiences and the environments in which we were raised, and most of us have earned a few scars from those things over the years. I've been making it my mission to help people learn to accept themselves and have compassion for everything that they've survived. Through deep and vulnerable conversations with some amazing women, you're going to hear about major moments in their life when they chose to color outside the lines and demonstrate firsthand just how capable we all are. So get ready to be inspired as we color outside the lines and make something beautiful. I am beyond excited to get to introduce you guys to Ashley this week. I've been low-key stalking her on Instagram for so long before I finally got the nerve to ask her to come on the podcast and talk about her experience with Mormonism. Ashley does such a beautiful job of navigating the complexities of religion and having left a religion while still also being respectful of said religion. I know when you guys hear her story, you're going to feel the immediate friend connection that I did. So tune in now.
I currently reside in Cedar City, Utah, which is a small town in the southern part of the state. And I actually grew up here. So I was born and raised in Cedar City, Utah, and I lived here for 18 years. I was born and raised in the Mormon church. And then when I was 18, I moved to Southern California.
Small town, like how small are we talking?
It's actually a lot bigger now. I want to say, including all the outskirts now, it's like 50,000. But when I was growing up, probably closer to 30. We also have a university here, so it's decent. We do have an airport. It only flies to Salt Lake, though, so it's a small little airport.
So in that area, is Mormonism like the primary religion of people in that area?
Yes. And I would say majority of Utah, especially northern Utah, has become more diverse. But in where I live, you knew who was Mormon and who was not Mormon. And majority of people were Mormon. Very few were not. And it's more diverse today. But again, you know who is Mormon and who is not, based on just even appearances at this point, let's be honest. In Mormonism, they wear a certain type of underwear underneath their clothing that are called garments. And for women, they're like a t-shirt like I'm wearing, and then quite long shorts for underwear. And so their clothing has to cover that. So especially in the summer, if nobody's wearing shorts and they don't, you can't see their chest. I mean, there's lots of telltale signs that someone is wearing garments or someone isn't, which is a whole other host of mental health stuff in general. I mean, because people are very cognizant of who is wearing garments and who is not when you are a member of the church. Also, they don't allow tattoos. I think that's since changed, but when I was raised in it, no tattoos. You could only have one earring hole. The rules change quite a bit. So now I think that's shifted and they're trying to be a little more open to tattoos and piercings. But at least when I grew up in it, those were some of the rules. But garments everyone wears them now, and they've really cracked down on it. Every 6 months, the Mormon church does what's called general conference, where the leaders of the church speak to their entire congregation. So there's no church, and they speak to all members, and a lot of times they'll have new rules, or they'll give a new talk, and they'll have new revelations. And they recently really cracked down on garment wearing, and that everyone needs to be wearing them. And the only exceptions are swimming, sex, and I can't remember the other one.
Interesting.
Fascinating. I know.
Okay. So what was your experience like growing up in the church?
So my experience, and I think why I can talk so openly about it now, is because I did not grow up in a traditional Mormon family. And what that means is my father was not a member of the church. So my mom was, my dad was not, and my dad was not a member until I was 10 years old. So the first 10 years, I grew up in a Mormon home that didn't have what's called a priesthood holder. And a priesthood holder is the male in the family, the patriarchy. And it's really frowned upon to not have a priesthood holder in your home. And so priesthood holders in the church are all men. You have to be a man, obviously. And they are allowed to do like all of the blessings and baptisms and things like that. So in the Mormon church, when you're born, you get what's called a baby blessing. And my dad couldn't do that to me, and neither could my mom, because women aren't allowed. So I think it was my great grandpa who gave me a baby blessing, which I feel silly talking about this, but as I understand trauma and really understand how our nervous system receives trauma, I often think about, oh, little 3-month-old me knew my dad wasn't blessing me. Like, I know that sounds crazy, but I go there. That's what I think, because I think that when you start attending a high demand religion like Mormonism from the time you're born, you become indoctrinated and it gets programmed into your brain.
I have never heard anybody reference religion as high demand. And as you said it, I was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. But I never would have put those words together.
Yeah. And it's so fascinating too, because, you know, we think about kid brains, and 0 to 5 is when they're the most vulnerable, and they are exposed and emerged into this doctrine from the time they're out of their mom's womb. Like,
yeah.
So I went to church on and off as a little girl, but I have like memories at my first church. So the Mormon churches ran like a business, and there's Mormon churches everywhere. And they're all broken up to stakes and wards, and like someone's overseeing them. So everyone has a place to go. So I could travel to Minnesota. I could find out where the Mormon church is there, and based on where I live, I would know which ward to go to. It's a really well organized ran business. So I remember the first church house when I had this feeling, and I don't know if it was a primary teacher. I don't know if I was just sitting and like they were talking on the pulpit, but it was very clear that my dad, because my dad wasn't there with us, was less than, because he was not a member of the church and he didn't have the priesthood. And I remember feeling that as a little girl, like really in my body, like, there's something the matter, you know. And I couldn't name it then, obviously, but I can definitely name it now for what it is.
Is there that feeling of otherness then when you're like looking at other families and you're like, oh, they're real Mormons, or they're full, you know, immersed in this, and you're kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out? Like, I have to imagine that like creates some type of dynamic.
You just literally defined my entire existence for the first 18 years of my life. I always felt like I was never a good enough Mormon. Even after my dad was baptized, I just never felt like we were ever that typical Mormon family. And it was really, really hard. I had a couple friends in high school who they weren't Mormon. And I felt like they were more accepted because they weren't a part of it. But it's like, if you're a part of it and you're not all the way in, then you're really committing a bigger sin, because you have the truth and you have the knowledge, but you're not following it, or your family's not following it to the way they're supposed to. And so the whole premise and how Mormonism gets people is they say that families can be together forever. I like to say there's a little asterisk to that, or families can be together if, and their belief is you could be with your family forever, but everyone has to be going to church. Everyone has to be paying tithing. So they have to be paying 10% of their income to the church. They have to be attending temple, which temple is completely different than church. And everyone has to be following the word of wisdom. So those are the rules. So no coffee, no alcohol, no tea, wearing your garments, you know, all of those things. Well, because my dad wasn't a member, there was no way we were all going to be together forever, because the only way we were going to be together forever is if my dad was a member of the church and him and my mom were married in what's called the Mormon temple.
Is that scary to a kid to think like, I'm not going to have my whole family with me in like eternity that everybody talks about?
Yes. Terrifying. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be with my family forever. And I would say for clients that I work with, this comes up all the time, especially when we're talking about situations like my circumstance, right? Mm-hmm. So my dad says to me later on in life that he got baptized because of me. So I was like 10 years old. So I only can imagine the amount of pressure I was putting on him to get baptized, because I wanted this eternal family. I was 10 years old. Like, it's so wild for me to think about now. And And my dad and I kind of have a bit of an estranged relationship, but that's one of the things that he said to me. He's like, I got baptized for you. And I'm like, dude, I was 10, you know?
Right.
But I think what that really highlights is the level of indoctrination that comes from growing up and being exposed to a religion at a very young age. And then when your family doesn't fit the mold, you literally try to do everything to make them fit the mold or make yourself fit the mold, right? When you're 8 in the church, that's when you get baptized. My dad wasn't a member, so he couldn't baptize me. So I had like some random cousin baptize me. And then when I was 10, my dad got baptized, and then he could baptize my brother. And then my parents got married in the Mormon temple. So, you know, the big, gorgeous buildings that the Mormon church has.
From the documentaries I've watched. That is my only reference point.
So I call them power symbols because the only way you can go to those big, beautiful, gorgeous buildings is if you follow all of the rules and you have what's called a temple recommend. And that's where they have their marriages. You can also do when you're like a young person in the church, so young being 12 to 17 years old, you can do what's called baptisms for the dead in Mormon temples. So what that means, because this gets a lot of people. It's a little controversial in my opinion, and I've participated in it maybe once or twice. I don't remember exactly, but you can go to the temple and do baptisms for the dead. So what they do is they just basically pull up people who have passed away without their consent, obviously, because they're dead, without their family's consent, and they baptize you.
Are you talking like dead bodies from like graveyards?
No, they like pull them up like from a scroll, and then they baptize you by proxy. But yes, it's essentially you're working with like dead spirits.
I just imagine like these kids out like shoveling, grave robbing.
I mean, but like it kind of depends on your belief system, right? So then when you get married in the temple, you have like your own marriage ceremony. But no one's allowed to attend that ceremony unless they're worthy Mormons and they follow all the rules and they meet with like their Mormon leadership, and the leadership gives them permission to go.
The mental health implications of worthy anything. Oh my gosh, my therapist skin is crawling.
Yeah, and we'll get there. So my parents did that when I was 10, and I remember being in the room. Like you go as a kid, you can go into what's called the sealing room. That's when they like seal you all together so you can be together for eternity. And it was just all these adults, and they were wearing weird outfits. And it was just, I wouldn't say it was traumatizing, but it's an experience I'll never forget in my entire life. Because it was almost like this pressure of this is what you need to do. And even though it feels really weird and icky, like everyone's going to do it. And my parents were now married in the temple, and we were going to be together forever. And my parents started wearing garments. And I would say like maybe we were a little bit like traditional Mormon and went to church a little bit more after that for a little bit. But then my freshman year of high school, I was on a cruise with my family, and we were there with a bunch of other families from the community who were very Mormon. And my parents were drinking on the cruise. And obviously drinking is a big no-no in Mormon culture, and it's against what they call the word of wisdom. So like that set of rules. And I remember I was sitting at your big cruise dinners, and you each have your own tables and you can sit with groups of people. Well, my parents were at a table with like a bunch of their friends, and I was at another table with some friends and adults. Like there was just a bunch of families on this trip. And I will never forget this moment either. This Mormon man, he was an older father figure, looks at my parents' table, looks at me, and says, "You never want to be like that," about my parents to me at 15 years old.
Okay, so what kind of 15-year-old are you? Are you one who like talks back? Are you a people pleaser? Are you quiet? I need to know.
Oh my gosh. I was like this obedient, like in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm never going to be like that. Because I'm just so like, I'm clinging so hard to trying to be this really good Mormon. Mind you, like behind the scenes, struggling a lot. And I would say once I hit puberty, I was struggling a lot, because the whole purity culture in Mormonism is they like tell you that having sex before marriage is a sin next to murder. That's what they say to a lot of people.
Oh my gosh.
I think that they have shifted the language around that, but there's definitely been messages, and it's just, I mean, it's it's worse than doing drugs and alcohol. I mean, it's just you're made to feel disgusting about it. So obviously, as any normal person going through puberty, I'm curious about my body. I'm like having all of these sensations. I'm very interested in boys. I think I was probably more interested in boys because of the culture I was raised in, because I was told, one, you're taught from the time you're tiny to get married, like that you're going to get married.
Right.
So how can you not be obsessed with boys?
Well, because yeah, your purpose in life is to find the guy for the family who can then structure your life
Yes.
and let's have all the things.
Yes. And so I even was going through some old pictures the other day and I found this picture and I'm in this wedding dress. I'm 12 or 13. And when in the Mormon church for youth, they have what's called young women's and young men's. So where you go to like learn how to be a good little woman in the Mormon church in a high demand religion, right? So I would say that you could apply that type of like about being a mom and taking care of kids and cooking and cleaning and sewing and all the womany things, right? In gendered culture, that's essentially what young men's and young women's are. Anyway, so it's this event that they did for young women's. I was 12 or 13 and we were trying on temple appropriate wedding dresses. And I pulled up the picture. That's what's just wild about all of this now is at the time it's normal. This is just what you do. Like I was so excited to wear that wedding dress. It was my aunt's wedding dress. I thought it was the most beautiful thing. Yeah. So but of course, like I was so fixated on having a boyfriend and getting married at, by the time I was in high school. So like I said, I was really sexually curious, I would say. And because of that, I got myself in some precarious situations with boys. And I can look back and say, oh, this is like normal sexual development for an adolescent, right? To make out and touch and like explore. But I had been told like, this is not okay. This is not okay. This is not okay my whole life. And so when I was probably 15, I decided I needed to confess to my Mormon bishop.
Ooh, I don't love where that's going.
Yep. So they have what's called worthiness interviews. That's what we were talking about earlier. So in order to go to the temple, you have to be worthy, right? And so they conduct worthiness interviews in the church. And you have to go sit and talk to a bishop who is a male, who has no training. So in a lot of Christian churches, pastors have to go through like a set of schooling. Like there's requirements to become a pastor in a lot of places. Not in the Mormon church. There's no requirements at all. There's no background checks. So anyone can just
go up there and speak and like be a leader. And
so they have to be called into a leadership position, and called means that the spirit prompts whoever to bring them into positions of leadership. So it can be, and that you have to be male, obviously, you have to be worthy, but it could be anyone, like anyone, any lay person, doesn't matter their background. Well, you wouldn't know their background because there's no background check. So that's who is leading Mormon congregations across the world.
I'm just like speechless because I mean, I'm an anxious person in general, and just thinking about like all of the ways that could go sideways and all of the ways that you are putting vulnerable people in jeopardy by doing that.
It goes sideways so much so. So anyways, I'll tell my story a little bit about that, and then we can talk a little more about why it goes sideways. But so I was 15. Mind you, my bishop was like my childhood friend's dad, who I'd like played at their house all the time. Don't worry, I still see him in the community now because still lives here. I go and I like tell him like, oh, I let my boyfriend touch my boobs, whatever. Just me and him in a room by ourselves. And then I received my punishment, which my punishment or my repentance was I couldn't take the sacrament for 2 weeks. So sacrament similar to like communion. And then, except it's with water and bread, there's no wine. I feel like I need to make that clear. I couldn't take the sacrament for 2 weeks, and I can't remember. I probably had to pray. The thing with the sacrament is it's public. So everyone knows if you don't take it. So Sunday came and I was in church and I passed it, and my dad looks at me. He goes, what did you do that was wrong?
Public shaming.
And I think what really gets me now, it goes back to this man who is a good man, like bless his heart, this bishop. From what I know, he's a good man. He's put in an impossible position, in my opinion. As you know, you're a mental health professional, and the amount of training that we receive in order to do our job, and then that we continue to receive if we want to be good at our job, it's never ending, right?
Right.
So to imagine these men dealing with the human condition with no training, no support, I think they get a handbook to read. Handbook.
Perfect. Perfect.
But what did I need at that time? I needed someone to be like, hey, it's okay. This is what teenage girls do. You're just exploring your body. There's nothing the matter with you. You know what I did? I just needed someone to be like, you're worthy just the way you are, and you don't need anything to fix this.
Right.
And I didn't get it. And I mean, I think it was just, I remember in church the shame I felt when I didn't take the sacrament. It was, it just was completely like so visceral in my body. And I said to myself in that moment, I will never do this ever again. So then I was like, I'm never going to confess ever again. I'm going to just be deceitful. So then that also takes a toll on your nervous system.
Yep, it does.
Because you're living this double life of, this is what I'm being told to do, and this is what I'm doing, because I was not following the rules, you know?
Well, it's also that beach ball metaphor of like trying to hold the beach ball underwater at the pool, and you can only do it for so long before it explodes back up.
Yep.
Yeah.
The beach ball was like literally from the time I was 15 until 22, that was my life. And I would get in these situations where I would get myself in a precarious situation with a male, do things that I don't even think I wanted to do a lot of times.
Yeah.
And then just hate myself for it. And it was just over and over and over and over again. And it's so fascinating because I do a lot of my own inner work as a therapist. I've done a lot of my own therapy. And for a long time, I thought my biggest trauma were the choices I made in college, the drinking too much, getting myself in situations with men that I didn't want to be in, all of that. And doing all of the trauma work I've done, I've realized that the root was this shame, this conditioning and programming I received from a very tiny age of, this is what it means to be a worthy woman.
Right.
And so that's given me a lot of healing in my own, like, in how I perceive myself and my choices. Like, I was just trying to figure out how to survive. I was adapting the only way that my nervous system knew how. And fortunately, I didn't get myself into a situation that caused, serious damage. I could have. I think I'm very lucky when I look at some of my choices.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of women can say that in college, that, they made some decisions that were like, oh, wow, it's a miracle that I survived that, or it didn't turn out badly. I'm really curious, how did you decide to get into your own therapy? Because I have to imagine that the Mormon church is not a fan of you like outsourcing mental health concerns.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's something they really, they say that they refer to mental health services, which they do, but that's through what's called LDS Family Services, which LDS is the proper name for Mormonism, Latter-day Saints. But because they don't like to be called Mormons now, it's very weird. Like I said, they change their rules a lot. But all the therapists they refer to are members of the church. So imagine if I'm going to feel safe to go be like, oh yeah, like I'm really interested in, like, I'm really sexually curious. I'm not going to say that to someone who is a true believing Mormon. That doesn't feel safe, right? I never was referred to do that. I was also really good at hiding all of this. Brooke, like, no one who knew me knew that I was going through this, because that's a whole part of this religion is you can just like button it up and have your appearance, and that's it,
And we just talk now so much more about the impacts that masking has on somebody's life. And it's not even like you were wearing a mask. It was like a full bodysuit of like, this is who I am and this is how people have to see me.
Yeah. I think that I'd always been really curious about other types of people, other religions my whole life. Obviously, how could I not? My dad wasn't a member. I have so many family members on his side of the family. All of his family's not members. So I was around a lot of different diverse people. And that turned out to be my saving grace. And I even say this about my dad now. I'm not even trying to get emotional, but I think it's just because of the state of our relationship. But because of him and because of his background, that's why I'm no longer a member. I mean, or that's like a huge part of why I had the ability to leave the church. So I lived in Southern Utah for 18 years, went to high school, all of this like underneath suffering. But it was required. My parents made it a rule that I had to move away for college. And yeah, that was like a rule, which actually I'm very grateful for to this day. But I had spent a lot of time in Southern California. Like I said, I had a lot of family. My paternal grandma used to live in Huntington Beach. I have cousins who I'm very close to that have a vacation home in Laguna Beach. So I just spent a lot of time at the beach growing up, and especially through high school. And so when I was applying to colleges, I applied to a ton of schools in Southern California. And I got into this small school in Los Angeles called Loyola Marymount University, and it was like right on the coast. It's the most beautiful campus. I am so privileged and grateful that I was able to go there. And I obviously moved to LA when I was 18, and it was the biggest culture shock of my life.
Imagine. Holy crap.
Yeah. But fortunately, by that point, when I had moved, I had already been really stepping outside of the church. So I was already doing a lot of the things I wasn't supposed to be doing. So I tried drinking. I wasn't going to church. I was really questioning lots of things, right? And in high school, I was always really curious about the people who weren't following the rules. I was like, huh. And they were more open about it, and they were more able to be themselves about it. I was always just really curious about their stories, which I mean makes sense now that I'm a therapist. So in college, the first couple of years, I definitely struggled. I was still trying to figure out like, who am I? And my friends, who none of them were Mormon, they were like, oh, you're Jack Mormon. And it was like so funny, right? Jack Mormon is what they call Mormons who don't follow the rules. And it was just like this funny thing. But I still would just have these episodes of deep, deep shame where I'd be like, oh my gosh, I drank too much. I hate myself. Or like I made out with this guy, or I hooked up with this guy and I hate myself. There's just like that vibe. And it was rough. I can go there and think about it. But in 2008, it was my sophomore year of college. They were having the election, and Prop 8 was on the ballot, and it was for gay marriage. And I had a girl in one of my classes, and she had two dads. And just hearing her talk about her dads and how much she loved them. And it was just like pure,
Yeah.
and I was already there. I mean, I was already like, there's no way this can be the only true church. Like, there's no way. There's so many good people everywhere. There's no way. I can't believe that this girl talking about her two dads, and her two dads are not good people because they're not Mormon. Like, that doesn't make sense, right? So anywho, the Prop 8 didn't pass, or I can't remember the ruling, but I knew that like gay marriage that first time around did not get passed in California. And I got an email from the Mormon church in the area inviting me to a celebration, because the Mormon church funded a lot of money for this to not be passed. And I read the email and I was so grossed out, Brooke. It's like, we are going to celebrate someone else's pain, as I thought of the girl in my class and her two dads not being able to get married and how heartbreaking that was. And then that was it for me. I was done. I didn't return to church after that.
Oh my gosh.
I was already so far gone anyways, but that was the end all be all for me. I stopped attending in 2008.
What a mature way to think about it, though, that like you saw it as a celebration of other people's pain. And I mean, clearly the Mormon church doesn't think that, but like, I don't think many people would think about it that way, that this celebration is literally delighting in keeping people love apart.
And that's exactly how it felt for me. And that's why, again, I think this is also another indication as why I became a therapist. I could just understand people and see people so differently than this like a very small-minded religion that I had been raised in. I don't even remember how I decided to become a therapist, but I did. And so then I moved to San Diego in 2010 to go to graduate school. And again, since 2008, I'd kind of like, I was done with the church. I really wasn't in Utah at all.
Did you tell your parents of your decision?
No, because they were already kind of on their way out too. So like I told you, we were on that cruise, they were drinking, they weren't really following the rules either. And we just kind of were like, okay, it's just whatever. My brothers weren't super into it either. They were both younger than me. I went to graduate school, became a therapist, and I started working in San Diego. I was working with at-risk youth in schools and just working with a lot of trauma. And honestly, that mattered far more than anything from my own life. You asked me earlier how I got into therapy myself, and it was my very first client. I remember sitting across from them. It was an 11-year-old and thinking, I can't do this job if I'm not doing it myself. And that's how I started my therapy. I think I did like anxiety therapy in college, but didn't really get super deep until I was in graduate school seeing clients.
Again, I have to highlight like how profound and mature of you to be like, if my clients are doing this work, I'm going to also do that work, because I think there's tons of therapists who don't approach it that way.
Yeah, I just remember, like, how am I going to hold space for her? How am I going to ask her to do X, Y, and Z when I am not doing that myself? And I still, to this day, 10, 12 years later, it's incredibly important to me for my healing journey. So in 2012, I met my now husband at a bar. I've come a long way.
You have come a long way.
And we went out on a date and we were on a hike. And he asked me if I was Mormon. Because obviously I was like, oh yeah, I grew up in Utah. And he's like, oh, so are you Mormon? That's what everyone asks.
Yes.
And I was like, well, no, I mean, I was raised in the church, but I'm not. And I remember how he responded. Like, he was kind of like, oh, like, it was icky that I could be Mormon potentially to him. Like, it was a red flag.
Ooh.
And I was like, oh, no, like, I'm out. I haven't attended. Because I really liked him. Obviously, we're now married. But it was the first time in my life where I had realized, oh my gosh, this is going to impact who I end up with. Like, this is bullshit. This is not going to impact who I end up with,
It's also interesting from the perspective of, for so long, it was the church judging people on the outside. And then when you got on the outside, like, people started judging the church or like receiving that feedback about the church. Like, it's just wild.
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, it had been 4 years. I was pretty far out and loved my life, loved myself. But then it was around that same time the church, I told you, does this thing where they make rules and then they change the rules. Well, they made it a rule that if your parents were gay, you couldn't be baptized. It was just like gross. It was so gross. Because
obviously that is the choice of the child, that their parent, like, of course, let's punish them.
I think they've since retracted that because obviously it was met with a lot of, like, people had a lot of issues. But I remember when that came across, I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm done. I'm getting my records removed. I want zero affiliation with this church at all. Because when you
tell me what's in a record.
So the Mormon church keeps records of all of their members, even if you don't attend. So they will say that their membership is very, very high. But that's based on anyone who has ever been baptized, which, if you're raised in Mormon culture, everyone is baptized at 8 years old. Everyone. I have people that I know who don't believe in the church, and they will baptize their kids because they don't want to upset their parents. Like, that's how deep this shit runs.
Mm-hmm. But like, what's in a record? Is it just like your like baptism date, or is it like
your baptism date? Census information, where your last known address, your parents' address, all your history, who's your family, are they their membership status, all of it. It's like a business. I told you.
It just sounds like so insidious that like they could look at this family tree that they're essentially creating and be like, where's the weak link? Where could we zoom in on and like hold people? Oh, yuck.
Yeah, sorry, I mean, bro, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, and I see this now. Like, Mormonism preys on vulnerable people. That's what they do.
Yeah,
like, let me get this 10-year-old girl to get her dad to get baptized. Like, I sit with that stuff all the time. So to get your records removed, I wrote a letter like, please remove my records. Well, they deny your request a lot of times. So they denied my request, and they had a bishop in the area in San Diego email me. And I said, please just remove my records. And he wrote back, and it was from like my work email. And so it had my like signature that I was a therapist. And he said to me in the email, I can't believe that someone in your profession would pick a permanent solution to a temporary problem or something like that.
What the fuck?
Yeah. And so remember that time when that dad said that to me and I was like, people pleaser, passive. Ashley, no, she was gone. And I was pissed. I was so mad. And he kept calling me sister. That's what they call like brothers and sisters. And I would just call him Mr. I would not call him bishop because he was not my bishop. And I finally said, I'm not having a conversation further, remove my record. So then they did. It took about 4 or 5 months for them to officially remove my records from the Mormon church. And I did tell my family at that time. My dad was like, whatever. Can you do mine? My brothers were like, whatever. And my mom, now it doesn't bother her, but she was like, I just don't know why you had to do that. I mean, my mom was also born and raised in it, very indoctrinated to believe like that's the only way you're getting to the highest kingdom in heaven is to be a member of the Mormon church. But since then, so since 2012, everyone in my family besides my mom has had their records removed. I just think my mom doesn't care to have her records removed. So yeah.
What are relationships like with family members right now?
So I know I've alluded to my dad. My dad, I guess it's related a little bit to Mormonism because, you know, I really prided that we had this family that was not traditional Mormon, like, especially as I became an adult, like, oh, see, we all freaking made it. We're just, you know, living the dream. I don't know. And in 2021, we found out that my dad was having an affair. So yeah, I was like, I was pregnant with my second baby and it was a big thing. It was 3 years ago. So him and my mom are now divorced. They were married for 33 years.
Oh my goodness.
So that was a really big wrench in the family system. I'm currently, I guess is estranged is the proper word for my dad right now, just based on some different life choices and decisions. And, you know, sometimes when you go through these types of traumas, it kind of, the curtain is taken away and you see things that have always been there your entire life, you know?
Isn't that such fucking shit? Like, that it's like, can I go back to being ignorant, naive like I used to be? Because life felt a lot better and now you can't unsee this.
No, you can't. And I think that's so true. I mean, for the Mormon church, for me too, right? Now I've seen it and I can't unsee it. My relationship with my mom is good. And both of my brothers I think we're all much happier and healthier outside of Mormonism than we ever were within it. I can obviously say that so wholeheartedly for myself, but even for my mom, and my mom has said to me too that she was so grateful that she was not a part of the church when this happened, because that would have just been met with so much shame and so much judgment and
of her.
Yeah.
What?
Because of the way it would have been approached too. And she would have been told basically, even though she would have been married 33 years, if she would have started dating again, she wouldn't have been allowed to be able to do. Like, there's just so much shame and patriarchy in that culture. It's kind of gross. And I think that it would have been very toxic for her to be a part of Mormonism when this happened.
So moving away from Mormonism, did anybody in your family explore other religions? Did you explore other religions? How do you identify now religiously?
No one is religious that I know of. It's interesting. I would say in the last couple of years, so I was trained in a form of therapy called brain spotting, and I do my own brain spotting sessions with a therapist, and it's an inside out process. So it's very much like a felt experience from within your own self. And that has become very spiritual for me. And in doing work with clients too, and feeling just their energy of their nervous system, I would say I do believe in a divine. I don't know what I would call the divine, but that it exists. And whether that's just within the own human experience or human condition, I feel that. And that has given me just so much more presence and clarity for the world around me and the people I work with and serve and hold space for. So I don't have a religion, but
there's some type of energetic power, being, whatever you want to call it. There's something.
Yeah, I do so much nervous system work within myself and with clients. I believe in it, and I believe that, healing is possible and healing extends beyond our like what is time, So that's been really profound for me too.
I'm just like so impressed that like you went from this people pleaser to somebody who's just like, no, I know what I believe and I know that this isn't right. Like, I'm so impressed by that. Is that something like somebody taught you? Is that something somebody like nurtured in you? Is that just something you got from like moving away from home and doing your own life? Like, where does that internal strength come from for you?
Whew, that's a good question. It's it's interesting. I think for a long time when I didn't live here, you don't know what you don't know. I mean, I had left it all behind, and in a lot of ways that was like, okay, I'm good. But on my wedding, I told my friend that married us, I said, I do not want God and I do not want Jesus brought up. Like I was very like anti-spirituality then. But I think that sometimes it's not until you have to go back to the place that had so much trauma for you that you have a choice to face it or not. And right, like I had been out of Southern Utah, I'd been out of the church for almost a decade when I moved back to Utah. And I was now a therapist and I was a trauma therapist. And I started to see things so differently than I ever had my entire life, even when I left, right? Because why would I re-examine something that wasn't impacting me anymore? And I honestly, Brooke, if I had never moved back to Utah, I don't know if I would have ever looked at this ever because it was not in my field. Am I grateful that I did and I moved back? Yes, because I do know it was impacting me on an unconscious nervous system level, right? Just from understanding trauma and working as a trauma therapist.
I know. Well,
But
because my other question for you was going to be like, what made you decide to move back and now raise your own children in the area that like provided so much trauma and like this framework of life that you don't agree with, knowing that that's the dominant people you're around?
yeah, this is a conversation my husband and I have quite frequently because he's not from here either. We were living in San Diego. We didn't have kids at the time. And it's so expensive to live in California. And we were just on that machine of going to work, being home for a couple, just like the work all day, be home for a little bit, go to bed, start over, do it again. And I just said to him, what are we doing? We don't have a mortgage yet. What's next? Because we want to have kids. We're going to work to pay for daycare all day. And that's kind of how we ended up back here. We both got jobs. I had family here. I mean, my whole family was here. This was before the affair, right? I thought I was moving back to my whole family and support. Since being like reimmersed back into Mormon culture, and having kids. So now I have 2 kids. It's been an interesting experience for me. It's something I reflect on a lot and I'm very cognizant of. The difference is my children are not going to church at all. Obviously, they've never even been to a Mormon church. They've never heard Mormon church doctrine. Never. I'm never going to say never because they're going to have friends that are Mormon and they might be exposed to it. But I just think I trust my ability and how I'm going to navigate those hard conversations, right? There's hard things wherever I choose to live.
Yes.
But I think, if it gets to a point where it's impacting their mental health, we will leave. I will choose my children, obviously. Southern Utah has been very, very good to us. And we're at a place as a family that we wouldn't be at if we were still in California. If you would have asked me when I went to school to become a therapist that I would have a practice in Southern Utah and I would be working with people who are struggling with Mormonism, I would have said like, no, that's not ever going to be something that I do. And there's such a need here for exactly what I do.
And I know not everybody is watching this, but like looking at your eyes as you're talking about this, there's like this fiery passion and also this like soft open arms that people just like can't see from listening to this. And so like your clients are just so lucky to have you. And I can just tell that just from like looking at how you talk about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And it's so funny. I had a practice for a year before I ever started talking about religious trauma, but it kept coming up almost every session on even an unconscious way. Like, holy shit, people are suffering so much here because of Mormonism, but we're not talking about it. If I go back to San Diego and work with inner city kids, we're going to talk about all the trauma that happens to inner city kids. That's like open conversation, right?
Right.
Here, If kids are struggling with Mormonism, they don't have a safe adult to go say, hey, I'm struggling with this belief system. I did it. Kids don't. I mean,
Right.
because their parents are Mormon, their teachers are Mormon, their principals are Mormon. They're obviously their Mormon bishops are not going to tell you. So it's just who's getting support. And so here
It's
I
so
am.
interesting. I know you're talking about it from like a Mormon perspective, and like where I'm living right now is a pretty conservative area, and it's Christian in the sense that it's like Lutheran and Catholic and kind of the traditional denominations of that. But there's a lot of people that come in and are like, "Oh, I have this like inherent belief about myself that like I'm always experiencing guilt, I'm always experiencing shame." And it's like, "Okay, where did you learn that? Where did you first learn that?" "Well, I've been going to church since I was born." It's like, "Oh, okay, like could that be factoring in?" For some people, yes. For some people, maybe no. And it's just like a lot of people have a hard time looking at religion as being something that could potentially be harming, because it does help a lot of people, get through the hard stuff and have a belief
Yes,
in a higher power. And like there are positive things about it too. It's a
absolutely.
very slippery slope, I think.
It is such a slippery slope and it's such a delicate thing to talk about. And
Mhm.
it's hard.
Yeah,
And I'm not anti-Mormon. I'm anti-trauma.
yes,
And I just, let's go back to the very beginning of this conversation. When you are born into a religion that has a prescribed set of ways that you're going to get to heaven, your brain as a little kid cannot process that. It doesn't understand it. And some little kids are going to be fine because their parents are following all the rules, or maybe they have a different temperament and they don't like whatever, just goes in one ear out the other, right? That's wonderful. That's the world we live in. But that's not how everyone's going to take it,
right,
right? We talk about trauma informed care a lot in this field. And I think religion, especially like a high demand religion like Mormonism or uber conservative Christianity, right? There's so many different groups out there, like not trauma informed. It's not,
correct.
you know?
I always like to ask people, if somebody else was in your shoes at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, or if you could talk to your younger self, what would you say?
Oh, gosh, you're like getting my emotions to come up today. Um, oh my gosh, I would first as soon like my little 18-year-old self, I would just go give her the biggest hug. And I would just tell her, one, you are so beautiful and incredible and smart. And I know things feel really hard right now, but life is going to turn out in a way you always imagined it to. And all of those daydreams that you had get to become a reality. And you're worthy just like you are. And it doesn't matter if you want to be sexual with boys, like that's normal sexual development. And that says nothing about who you are.
Oh my gosh, you're gonna make me cry.
And you're going to marry the most amazing man who's not Mormon and you met him at a bar. Just stay tuned.
How about, what is your best piece of advice for people to support individuals who are exploring religious trauma or thinking about faith deconstruction?
I would say, I think taking a curious approach is such a helpful way to meet people because it takes away the judgment, right? I have clients in my practice who are members of the church, not many, right? Because most people are coming to see me because they're struggling to leave, but I can't approach them being like, Mormonism just causes trauma and that's not going to meet them where they're at. It's just like, hey, I'm curious about how maybe your religious beliefs are impacting that anxiety you're feeling,
Yeah.
right? How are they impacting the way you feel about yourself? And they're like, they share, oh, I just feel so anxious. I just feel so anxious when I go to church. And oh yeah, just notice that. What does that tell you? Like, just really inviting that curious dialogue versus telling them what's happening, right?
Yes. Letting them figure it out for themselves.
But holding space too. I think there's a fine line of also sometimes you do have to be like, well, yeah, no one should ever tell you what kind of underwear you're supposed to wear. No one should ever have that responsibility for you, right? Like I think that there is a fine line of helping them identify maybe some red flags to
Yeah.
relationships, but also I just think curiosity is such a powerful tool for clients, for anyone who's struggling.
I want to go back to what you just said, because I'm sure you don't even notice that you said it because you probably say it all the time. But you said red flags in relationships as you were talking about Mormonism, because we do have relationships with our faith, and that is a thing. And people don't often acknowledge it in that way because it's not a human form of something. But we have relationships with social media, with religion, with all of the different things in society. And so I love how that came out so naturally for you.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't mean to, but it's so funny because I read something recently, but it was like talking about the rules of Mormonism, but it framed it as a relationship. Oh, these are the type of underwear you can wear. This is who you can get married to. This is what you can put in your body. And it said it was like a relationship, like, a partner telling you that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it said replace partner with any religion.
Yep. Yes, I love ending on that. Feels like the mic drop. So thank you so much for agreeing to share your experience with me and getting vulnerable and talking about all of this, because I think as the world changes and as our understanding of religion and the innate power that just humans have in brain spotting EMDR to heal themselves, I think a lot more of these conversations are going to start to happen. I'll cross my fingers anyways that they will.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me, Brooke. It was so nice to just talk about all of this with you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. I know that the topics that we talk about on this podcast can be heavy and bring up a lot of emotions for people, and that's no reason to shy away from these conversations. If you're a fan of trying to get these conversations out to as many people as possible, I could use your help. Rating, reviewing, and subscribing to the podcast helps it reach more people. I always love to hear your feedback on the episodes that we put out and the topics that you want to hear more about. So head to www.redbirdcounselingmn.com. From there, you can send me an email and join our online email community to get more updates about the podcast and everything happening mental health and Redbird counseling. Be sure to also follow us on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at Redbird Counseling MN and Facebook Redbird Counseling MN 21. Until next time, remember, you're not alone, your story matters, be kind to yourself, and don't be afraid to color outside the lines.